What's up YouTube, welcome to CodAffection. In this video we are going to discuss different ways to create forms in Angular applications. So first of all, I will get started with creating new Angular application. Suppose if you want to create a new application from this folder directory here, you have to run Angular CLI command from this folder directory. In order to open command from this folder directory, you can use the shortcut hold shift then right click, then select this option open command window here. So here we have opened this command prompt from corresponding folder directory. In order to create a new Angular application from this folder directory, you just need to execute this command ng new then application name. I will name this application as Angular Forms. Now hit enter. Then you need to answer a few questions for initial configuration of the application. Would you like to add Angular routing? Type N for no, hit enter. Which style sheet format would you like to use? I will stick with CSS, hit enter. Then it will take some time to create default components and modules. After all, it will install default packages from npm. So finally, as a result of command execution, here we have the new Angular application, Angular Forms. Now I want to open this project from IDE, Visual Studio Code Editor. For that, you can right click here, then open with code. So here we have opened the Angular application, Angular Forms from Visual Studio Code Editor. In order to discuss basics of forms or controls, I want to create a new Angular component. For that, you can go to terminal here, then new terminal. Then you can use this Angular CLI command ng generate. In short, you can use G, then component. In short, you can use C, and we have to give the component name. It will be symbol form. If we execute this component creation command here, it will have 4 files for single component. For example, here we have the default component with 4 files. One style sheet, one HTML file, one file with extension spec.ts which is for test purpose, and finally we have the TypeScript file. We don't need these 3 files for this symbol form component. In order to skip that, we can do this. We can add this flag inline styles so that the CSS rules can be added into TypeScript file itself. For that, you can use the inline styles flag or alias -s. In order to skip the creation of HTML file here, you can use the flag inline template. In short, you can use -t. Finally, we have to skip this test file with extension spec.ts. For that, we can use this flag skip tests. For that, we don't have any abbreviation or alias, so we have to type the enter flag skip test. Now hit enter. So here we have created the new component inside this new folder, simple form. Inside that we have a single file which is the TypeScript file for the corresponding component. Inside that you can see this template attribute of the component. Inside that we can specify the HTML for the component, and inside this styles array we can add CSS rules for the component. So in this way we have skipped creation of these 2 files, CSS and HTML file, so that I can explain these basic concepts with a single TypeScript file. Otherwise you have to switch between TypeScript and HTML files. Now before continuing with this component, let me run this application. For that, you have to run this Angular CLI command ng serve. It will compile and build this application. And finally, in order to open this application in your default web browser, you can use this flag ~o. Hit enter. It will take some time before showing this application in your default web browser for building and compiling process. This is how the fresh Angular application looks like. Now back to the Angular application here. Inside this project here we have the index.html, which is the basic file for every view of the application. Inside that we have the HTML declaration, header part and body part. Inside this body part we will display different components inside this application. Currently, you can see the app root selector, which is the component selector for the default component app component, which is here. So you can see the selector here. So wherever we place this selector, corresponding selector will be replaced by the corresponding HTML here. Okay, so these HTML are replaced inside this body part instead of this component selector. So this view here is rendered as a result of this HTML here. Now instead of this HTML, I want to show the HTML from this new component simple form. For that, we just need to add this selector inside this HTML here. So first of all, let me get rid of this default HTML here, and we want to add a tag with this component selector. So app hyphen simple form. In order to create a tag with this selector in Visual Studio Code Editor, you just need to hit tab here. So here we have the component selector inside app component HTML. Now let me save all of these modifications here, then back to the application. So currently inside this page, you can see this text simple form works as a result of the default paragraph inside the component here. The basic control inside a form is input control. So let me try to add an input control here instead of this default paragraph. So let me get rid of this default paragraph. Then I want to add an input element here. In order to render a text box, you just need this input tag here. Let me save this and back to the application. So here we have the text box. Now let me add a placeholder for this control. Placeholder is equal to search here. Save, then back to the application. So here we have the text box with the corresponding placeholder. As you might know, in order to create forms in Angular applications, we have two methods. One is template driven approach, in short TDF, and second one is reactive forms. Now I'm going to show you how to create a simple form without the use of any of these methods. As a first step, you just need to add a template reference for this input control like this. Search control. So here we have a reference in order to access this input control. Now I want to add another button here. Button. Inside the button, I want to give this text search. Let me save this and back to the application. So here we have a text box followed by a search button. Now let's add a click event for this search button here. For that, you can use this event click. So click is equal to, I will define another function on search, and we have to define this function on search here, on search. And inside this function, obviously we have to add steps for search operation. And into this function, I have to pass this control reference, search control. So let me copy this and pasting here, and I will have a parameter here, something obj. After all, inside this function, I want to log this object. So you can do this console.log obj. Now let me save this, then back to the application here. In order to see the console, you can right click here, then inspect, and here we are inside the console tab. Now let me enter some random text here. Now click on search button here. We have logged corresponding input control template reference inside this console window as a result of this. Now if you want to see the text inside this text box here, we just need to access value property from this obj object. Let me save, then back to the application. Let me enter some random text here. click on search. So here we have the same text from this text box. So these are the two basic controls required for a typical search operation in a website, one text box and a button. Now we have to enclose these two controls inside a form element so that we can trigger the search operation without clicking on this button here. You just need to type the text here, then hit enter. So it is a default behavior of form. Whenever we hit enter inside form controls, it will trigger the form submit event. So let me enclose these two controls inside a form element. Now we can move this onSearch function into the form submit event. So you just need to add this submit event here, and we will call this same function here also. Let me copy this and pasting here. Instead of sending the whole control reference, we just need the value. So you can just provide the value here. Okay. Now we can remove this click event from this button. By default, this button will be of the type submit. Since we are passing the text box value from this form submit event, we can make few changes inside this onSearch function here. It will be search text, and we can show that inside the console log. Let me save this, back to the application. Let me enter some random text here, hit enter. If you are really focused, the same text from this input control is displayed inside this console window. After that, this page is reloaded automatically. Let me try that again, hit enter. So same text is displayed here. After that, page is reloaded. It is a default behavior of HTML forms. When we submit the form, after the submit event, the page will get reloaded. Now let's prevent this default behavior of form. For that, back to this submit event here, and for any DOM event, we have the event variable $event. From that, we can call this prevent default function. Let me save this and back to the application here. Now let's enter some random text inside that and hit enter. Now you can see the text, and we have prevented the default behavior of the form, which is reload after submit event. So here we have the text from the input control from the form. So here we have discussed how to implement simple form in Angular only using template reference. You can use these types of form implementation when it comes to forms with one or two input controls. For example, search operation, or you can use this for login form with one or two text boxes with lesser complexity. When it comes to complex forms, we might have to deal with various operations or features like reset operation, client-side validation or server-side validation, control interactions, etc. So in those cases, we may have to choose either of the two methods which Angular provides. First of all, we have template-driven approach, or abbreviated as TDF, and we have the final option as reactive forms. So first of all, I will discuss what is meant by template-driven approach or TDF. In order to show you an example for template-driven forms, I'm going to create a new component like we have created this simple form component here. So for that, you can use the same terminal here. Then command will be something like this. Component name will be TemplateDriven Form. We don't need a separate style sheet file, so I will keep this inline styles flag here abbreviated as -s, and we need a separate template HTML, so we can remove this tag from here, and we don't need to create a separate test file for this component. So I will keep this skip test tag here. Now hit enter. So here we have created the component TemplateDriven Form. Inside that we have two files, one for HTML file and one for the TypeScript file. Now in order to work with TemplateDriven Forms, we have to import Forms module into this application. For that, you have to open app-module.ts file here. And here we have to import Forms module from Angular Forms. Forms module. Now let's add this module inside this imports array. Now back to the new component TemplateDriven Form here. For each control in our HTML form, we'll have a property in our TypeScript file, and we will bind them using two-way data binding. So let's look how we can do that. In order to explain this concept, I'm gonna design a form containing details of a book. Let's define the corresponding properties here. So first of all, public book title, which is of the type string. Like this, we have to define two more properties here. So I will copy this and pasting below that 2 times. Second property will be book author. Finally, we will have number of pages property, which is of the type number here instead of string. Now let's define a template-driven form using these properties inside the template HTML here. Let me get rid of this default paragraph here, and we will start with a form element here. We don't need this action attribute here. Inside that, first of all, I will start with label. Also, we don't need this for attribute here. This will be for book title. And here we have to add the input control to enter the book title. We don't have to specify the type of this input element. By default, it will be of the type text. First of all, make sure that in template-driven forms, we have to name the control. So I will name this control as book title. After that, we have to define the data binding using two-way data binding here. So here we have the square bracket banana symbol. Inside that we have ng model is equal to, here we just need to bind this property here. In practical applications, we will define these properties in a separate class often called as model classes. And we will make an instance of the class here, and using that instance we will provide the two-way data binding here. For now, we have the property inside this component itself, so we just need to give the property name here. Like this, we have to add two more controls. So let me copy this label text box pair and pasting below that 2 times for book author and number of pages. Let me update the name attribute and data binding. This will be book author, same property name, which is same as the property which we have defined inside the TypeScript file. Then after that we have book number of pages. This data binding should be matching to this property name here. Let me save all of these modifications here, then back to the application here. Currently we are displaying the former component, which is simple component here. Instead of that, we have to display this new component. So we have to give the corresponding component selector instead of simple form inside this app component HTML here. Now we just need to replace this selector with template driven form selector. For that, we have a shortcut in VS Code editor. you just need to select this selector here, then hold Control, then press D, so that both of these selector is selected. Now we just need to paste the copied selector of template driven form here. Boom. Let me save all of this modification. Back to the application here. So here we have the form which we have designed inside this template driven form here. For now, all of these components are displayed over a single line. In order to separate them into multiple lines, I will add break tag here. I will add BR tag here. Now beneath all of these controls, I will add a button of the type submit. By default, button will have the type submit. Inside the button, I will have this text submit. Now let's define a submit event for this form. For that, we can use this submit event is equal to, we'll have a function on submit. Okay, now inside this on submit function, we should have to have a way to access the state of the form and values of the controls inside the form. For that, first of all, we have to add a template reference for this form here. It will be something like a book form, and we have to assign that with this ng form. Okay, now we can pass this book form into this function on submit. Now let's define this function on submit inside the TypeScript file here. On submit with a single parameter form, and here we have to add the required submit operations. Just below that, we have to display values inside these controls here. We can do this console.log. We just need to access the value property from this template reference. So form.value. Let me save all of these modifications here. Then back to the application. Now let's open the console here. Book title will be An American Marriage. Author Tayari Jones. Number of pages, something 350. Now let's submit this. Inside the console window here, you can see the values of the form controls that we have shown here. Book author, book number of pages, book title, etc. The benefit of using these two methods which Angular provides, which are template driven form or reactive forms, which already comes with a simple way of implementing mandatory features of a form. For example, in previous simple form, we have a manually blocked default behavior of a form, which is reloading of a page after submitting the form. Inside this form, we don't have to do something like that. This template driven form already comes with such features. Apart from that, these methods has a simple way of implementing features which a normal form requires. For example, if you want to add a required validation for this book title here, you just need to add an HTML validation or attribute to this book title here, which is required, and using this template reference book form inside this TypeScript file itself, we can check whether the form is valid or not. For example, I'm gonna add one more log statement, so it will be valid property. Okay, now back to the application here. Now if you submit this, you can see that Here we have the values from form controls, and here we have the value of valid property. Currently this form is not valid because title text box is empty, so we have valid property as false. If you type something inside this and then submit, here we have the valid property with true value. We can do much more. Suppose if you want to disable this submit button but this form as a whole is not valid. For that we can do this. Here we can add the disabled property, disabled, and we will apply this property when this form as a whole is not valid. So we can do this. Here we have the form reference dot valid, and here we have the negation. So when this form is not valid, we will apply this disabled property into this submit button. Let's see that. Let me save this back to the application. Initially you can see that this submit button is disabled because this form as a whole is not valid. Now if you enter something inside the text box, this submit button becomes enabled. Also you can check whether the form is valid or not from this TypeScript file here. For that we just need to add this if clause here. We only have to do all of these operations when the form is valid. So we can do this. Now let's move a step forward. If you want to show a validation error message just beneath this control if the control is not valid. In order to do that, we have to reference this control like we referenced book form here. So we can add a template reference for this control here. It will be, I will add this prefix ctrl for control for title. We can add this label here. Inside that I will show this field is mandatory. Now let me move this break after this error message. Let me save this and back to the application here. Now if you inspect this, we don't have to show this error message every time. We only want to show this when this control is invalid. For that, in order to check whether this control is invalid or not, you can inspect this input control here. It has these classes ng pristine, ng invalid, and ng test. These classes which has the prefix ng dash, which is applied as a result of the two-way data binding here. This ng pristine class implies this control's value is not changed from its default value after displaying the form, and this ng invalid class shows this control is invalid. This ng test class means this control is visited. Otherwise initially it would be ng untouched, that you can see here, ng untouched for the remaining two controls for book author and number of pages. If there is a value from its initial state, this ng pristine will be replaced with ng dirty, and if it is valid, this ng invalid will be replaced with ng valid. Now using these informations we can check whether a control is invalid or not. Now back to the project here. Here we have added a reference to this control which is a normal template reference. Using that we have to access the properties which applied onto this control as a result of this two-way data binding here. Now we can access informations like whether the control is valid or invalid, whether it is visited or unvisited, whether the value is changed or not, using this template reference here only when we initialize that with ng model here. Now using this template reference we can access those such informations. Now for example, we only want to show this validation error message only when this control is invalid. So we can add the ng if detective here. Basically it will show and hide the control based on the condition we provide inside that. So here we have the condition. We only want to show this label when this control is invalid. Okay, let me save this. Back to the application. So you can see the error message here. This field is mandatory. You can even show this message in red text. So color is equal to red. Currently this control is invalid. If you enter something inside that, it becomes valid. Suppose if you don't want to show this error message initially, you only want to show this error message if the control is visited or its value is changed from its default value. In that case, we can have corresponding properties to these classes ngDirty and ngText inside this local reference here. So we can add few more conditions here. This control is invalid and either this control is touched or its initial value is changed. So we can check whether it has this control dirty as true. This error validation will be shown when this control is invalid and either the control is touched or its value is changed from its initial state. Save. Back to the application. Initially you can't see the validation error message even the control is not valid. If you enter something inside that or if you visit the control, you can see the error message. Okay. So currently we have discussed the validation procedure in a form with the help of template-driven forms in Angular. It will be more difficult if you were using a simple form method. Like this, Angular methods of form implementation helps to implement features of a norm easily. Now let's discuss the second method of form implementation, which is reactive form approach, and why we need reactive form approach. As a first step, we have to implement corresponding module inside this project. Here we have the app module. Here we have to import reactive forms module like we imported this forms module here. For that, first of all, you can add the import statement here and then you can add that class module here. Or you can do this, just type that module name here, reactive forms module. You can see the module name inside the auto suggestion. If you click on that, corresponding module import statement will be added at the top here. So here we have the reactive forms module import statement from the same path where we have imported this forms module. Now, in order to explain the use and benefit of using reactive forms module, let me create one more component. So let me add a new terminal. In order to create a new component, you can use this ng command here. So here we have the previous command which we have used for the creation of template-driven form component. In same way, we have to create a reactive form component. So we can do this. Reactive form component. So here we have skipped the creation of the separate style sheet, and here we have skipped the test file with extension spec.ts. Now hit enter. As a result of the command execution, here we have a new folder with component name reactive form. Inside that we have one template HTML file and one TypeScript file also. In reactive forms approach, for every HTML control, there will be an instance of form control class in TypeScript file. Normally, we will group all of these form control instance into a form group instance. For example, let me create an instance of form control first name. And we can initialize this property with an instance of form control class. Now we have to add the corresponding import statement for this form control class. For that, while typing this class name here, we can see the auto suggestion list here. If you click on this, it will add the import statement at the top. Otherwise, if you have typed the complete name of the class, you have one shortcut. Hold Control, then press period or dot symbol. Then click on this import statement here, import form control from Angular Forms. So here we have added the corresponding import statement. Now let me open the corresponding component TypeScript file here. Let me get rid of this default paragraph here. I will add an input control here. You don't need to specify the type of this control. By default, it will be text. Now we have to bind this input control to this form control instance first name. For that, we can do this. Form control is equal to first name. Now let me save all of these modifications here and back to the application here. We have to change the component selector. In order to display the new component, we have to change the component selector inside this app component HTML file here. Now it is reactive form. So app dash reactive hyphen form. Let me check that here. App hyphen reactive form. That's it. Let me replace that here. Save, then back to the application here. So here we have the new input element. Now back to the reactive form component. Inside this instance constructor, you can pass the, as a first parameter, you can pass the default value of the control here. As a second parameter, you can pass the validations for this control. As a third parameter, you can pass the async validator for this control. So for now, let me save this back to the application. So as a default value here, we have ABC. Now let's add one more input control. So here we have the reactive form component. Now let's add last name is equal to new form control. For now, we don't need this default value here. So here we have two properties initialized with form control instance. So basically here we create form control instance for every control that we have to add inside our HTML file. In order to make this process a little bit easier, we will group all of these form controls as form group. So let me name the group here employee form is equal to, in order to group all of these form controls, we have to create an instance of form group. If you click on this, corresponding import statement will be added at the top. So here it is. Now inside this class constructor, we can pass an object like this. Inside that, we can pass all of these properties of the type form control. So let me cut this and paste here. Instead of this equal symbol, we have to use the colon, and we don't need this semicolon. Instead, it will be a comma since it is a JSON object. Now back to the component HTML here. Here we have the control for first name. Now we have to update this form control binding to the instance since we have made some changes for the form model here. So it will be something like this. We have the property employee form, which is of the type form group. Inside that we have this list controls. Inside that we will have this first name property. Like this, we can add the second text box for last name. Back to the application. So here we have the two text box for first name and last name. Now let me enclose all of these controls inside a form element. So it will be something like this. You don't need this action attribute. Let me move this close tag after all of these controls here. Now we have to associate this form to this parent group employee form. For that, we can use this property binding here. Form group is equal to employee form. Now in order to make this binding more easier, we can use form control name attribute instead of this form control property binding. So it will be something like this. Form control name is equal to, we just have to provide this first name here. We don't have to provide this part here, providing the path of the control instance in relation to this employee form group instance. So inside this form group instance, we have this property first name, which is of the type form control. Like that, we can use the attribute binding for the last name control here. So let me copy this attribute binding and I will paste that here. Instead of first name, we have last name. Let me save all of these modifications and back to the application here. That's it. Now let's add a label along with this input controls. Label, we don't need this for attribute here. This will be for first name. And we have to do the same for the second control for last name. Label, we don't need this for attribute. This is for last name. Back to the application. Now we have to add a break here, line break. That's it. So inside this form control model, we have two form control instances which we have grouped into another form group of the name employee form. And thereby we can say that the implementation of reactive form is a structured approach. And because of this structured implementation, it will help us to design the form here. Now inside this form model, we can add another form model. For example, I will add the address part here. Address is equal to new form group. Inside that, we can pass an object containing required properties of the control. So it will be something like this. Street is equal to new form control. And then after that, we will have city. Then after that, we will have the state. So this is for city. And below that, we have state. Now in order to add the corresponding form control instance HTML controls, we can do this. First of all, let me add a heading H4 and saying this is for address section. And below that, we can add a div indicating this div contains controls from this nested form group address. For that, you can use this attribute form group name is equal to address. Inside that, we can add label text box pair like we have done here. So let me copy this and pasting here. First of all, we have street. So corresponding property name will be street. As an outer element inside this, we have the form, which is for this employee form. Inside that, we have another form group address. So here we have another div which specified all of the controls inside this will be from this address form group. Inside that, we have this street property here. So it will make the implementation or designing of the form easier. Like this, we can add label text box pair for city and state. This is for city. Form control name will be city. And then here we have the state. Let me save all of these modifications here and back to the application. Now let's add required line breaks here. I have not used Bootstrap for this tutorial in order to make this tutorial more simpler. Let me save all of these modifications here and back to the application. So here we have displayed all the required form controls. After all, let me add a submit button here. So here we have the button text will be submit. Now let's add a submit event here. So submit is equal to on submit function can be called here. Now let's define this function inside the TypeScript file here. On submit, inside that, first of all you can do the required submit operations here. After that, I will log the values from form controls. For that, we can do this console.log function can be called. In order to display the values from these controls here, we can use this outer form group instance employee form. We just need to do this dot employee form dot value property can be accessed. Let me save all of these modifications here and back to the application. Let me enter some random text here. Submit. So here we have the JSON object containing corresponding form control values. So here we have the same structure as that of the form model. We have the first name and last name, and inside this address property we have the nested form control values. In order to make this process more easier, here we have manually created instance of form control for every control. Instead of creating form control instances manually, we can use the alternative method from this reactive forms approach, which is using FormBuilder class. So this is by using form control instance. Now let me comment this. And now let's use the form builder. So employee form is equal to, in order to use the form builder, first of all we have to inject form builder instance here. So public FB, which is of the type form builder. In order to import the corresponding class, you can click the option from this auto suggestion list. So here we have added the corresponding import statement. Now we can do this dot FB dot group function can be called. Inside that we can pass these control names as an array. So first of all we have first name, and which is equal to an array. So inside this array, as a first element we can pass the default value. As a second element we can pass the validator. As a third element we can pass the async validator. In this tutorial I'm not going to cover the validation in detail, so for now we can keep that here. After this we have last name. Let me copy this and pasting here. After that we have a nested form group of the name address is equal to, we can do this dot FB dot group function can be called again. Inside that we can do the same. Let me copy this and pasting here. First of all we have street, then city and state. Now rendering of this form model is similar to that of this model here, so we don't have to change the structure of the form here. Let me save all of these modifications here, back to the application. That's it. So here we have a small implementation of employee form rather than this long employee form definition. In order to receive the values from form controls, we can do the same here. We just need to access this value property from this employee form object. So that's it guys. Here we have discussed all the possible ways to create forms in an Angular application using simple form without use of any methods which Angular provides. We can use that for simple forms with one or two controls. And then we have discussed template driven approach. In case of template driven approach, we don't have a well structured form model. Here we have the properties, or we may have a class which contains all of these properties. You can use template-driven approach in case of forms with lesser number of controls. For example, you can use a registration form with lesser number of controls, which may not be extended in future. Since template-driven forms model is not structured, we are going for reactive forms. In reactive forms, we have a structured form model. Based on that, we can design the form appropriately. Since the form model is structured, we can use this method for forms with higher complexity. So that's it, guys. You can download this demonstration project from the GitHub link given below in video description. In order to make more helpful and quality tutorials like this, you can support me through PayPal. I have given the donation link in first comment and video description. Please like and share this video with your friends and colleagues so that they can benefit from this. Have a nice day. Bye.